The screams are the things that still haunt me. Like when you hear a mother crying over her child and, it breaks you a little bit. And I remember there was a grown woman, she's old enough to be my grandma. She came up to me and she went, in Arabic, she said, "Ya doctor, idek baraka," which means your hands are a blessing. And she started kissing my hands and she goes, "Please, don't let her die." I'm looking at her daughter's burn, 80% burns to the body. Her limbs are blown off. She's dead, but she's kissing my hands and saying, "Please save my daughter."
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to TBN Studio. We have two very special guests here, Dr. Jeremy Hickey and Dr. Mohamed Mustafa. Both have recently spent some time in Gaza, so we'd like to hear from them their story and their experience. Dr. Jeremy, let's start with you. What made you decide to go to Gaza?
It was sort of a funny, circuitous route to arriving at the decision. But look, humanitarian work was always on the cards for me at some point during my life, probably a little bit later than what I ended up going. But I heard about a group from America that was looking for anaesthetists through a Facebook group. And given that I'm an anaesthetist by qualification myself.
Would you like to explain to our audience what anaesthetist?
Yeah, sure. So anaesthetist is basically a doctor who's specialised in putting patients off to sleep so they can have operations, or it can involve many other things as well. So we're particularly concerned with making sure patients have good quality pain relief and have appropriately cared for heart and lung systems while they're asleep, having operations as well.
Dr. Mohamed is from Palestinian background. That explains you spending time in Gaza?
Yeah, so it was actually my first time going to Palestine. I've actually got family in Gaza. My direct aunties and uncles and cousins all live in Gaza. And, I grew up as a refugee, so, I was never allowed to go back to Palestine until I became a British and Australian citizen. And, I jumped at the first opportunity that I got to go back home.
So this was the first time?
It was the first time. It was actually even the first time seeing my uncle and my cousins and my aunties, obviously because of the blockade of Gaza for the last 20 years. No one was allowed, we weren't allowed in. So
that was July this year?
June this year. Yeah, it was the first time I let them in.
What was your most prominent memory, profound memory of your time in Gaza?
Yeah, it's, from a medical perspective, my takeaway point is just the horrendous injuries that people are living with. The injuries that people suffer from explosions or from gunshots or anything like this, collapsed buildings, they're terrible to begin with. And if they survive those injuries, that's not the end of it, unfortunately. There's this ongoing issue of wound healing, which is very poor amongst the population who's got poor nutrition availability. And then there's infections and wound breakdowns, all these sorts of things. So surviving the injury is just the first hurdle. There's so many other hurdles that people have to get through to reach some end point from the injury itself. So medically, that was the biggest thing for mine. There's obviously many things that I took away from that, but that's the largest one.
You mentioned that you had mixed emotions of joy as well as sadness. Could you elaborate on that?
The joy was a product of interactions with the locals. It was hard to feel joy about any of the cases that we saw and the injuries that people suffered through. But the locals had this amazing resilience that we all hear about, especially the kids. They're always full of smiles and beaming, from ear to ear. And just, simple things as offering a high five or just, chasing them down a hallway. Just some menial sort of play would bring a lot of laughter and smiles. And it was a very uplifting sort of experience, especially when you consider how little they have, yet how much hope and how much purpose they still maintain in their lives. It was a good option to put a lot of things in my own life in perspective. And so it was uplifting in that sense, recognising in myself all the opportunity and resources and, things that I have in my life. I've got really no reason to be unhappy when you look at the amount of joy and hope and like I say, and purpose that these people still have. Yeah, the misery though was in seeing the constant loss of life and people suffering pain and infections, and it was just the never-ending sort of flow of patients with more new injuries, with dwindling resources. It was a very hard thing to reconcile when you're facing it day in and day out.
Let me describe, Dr. Mohamed, some of the conditions of the hospitals that you worked in all over Gaza.
I mean, where do you start, with the conditions? I mean, when we were at the European hospital, a lot of patients were camping out at the hospital. So you had thousands of people lining up the corridors, lining up the streets adjacent within the hospital compound. There's no running sewerage, so there's water that's running sewerage and you can smell it as you walk in. The amount of people that are amputated, that are there just, there's no wheelchairs because wheelchairs aren't allowed in either. So there's people carrying people, like family members, children carrying adults, adults carrying children.
Would you see day?
I mean, for me, because I'm in the emergency department, it was just, I would walk into the department. There's no triage, there's no, you don't come walk into the ED and get seen to and get given a number and stuff like that. This is a war zone, and you don't know who's going to arrive at work today and who's not going to arrive at work today because, people might get killed, before they come into work. The area that they might be in might be surrounded by the army and they won't be able to leave. So when you come into the emergency department, you don't know what kind of a team you're going to have. And then again, you don't know what kind of injuries you're going to deal with today. Are they going to bomb a school today? Are they going to bomb a refugee camp? Are they going to, starve people? Like, you just don't know what's going to come in. And as I would walk in, because they would see me as a foreign doctor, a lot of them would think, that I've got certain skills or resources that, the local doctors there didn't have, or I had equipment that they didn't have. So they'd want to come and see me. So, I'd be getting pulled literally left, right, and center to see patients. And there's no primary health care there. So, there's people who have got like uncontrolled diabetes for the last year who are now having sight problems and things like that. There are people who are going deaf because of the sonic booms. And the sonic boom is basically when the fighter jets fly at a low altitude and they break the sound barrier. They cause a shock wave that can cause people to have miscarriages. It shatters windows and people get shrapnel injuries from it. It causes women to miscarriage and it pops eardrums. So, that there was just so many different presentations that were coming into the hospital. The casualties that you see on social media where you see people with missing limbs or missing heads, that's just one part of it. Then you've got the other side of it. You've got, the old grandma who's got, who's on dialysis, who hasn't had dialysis in weeks, and she is really struggling, and her house is bombed, she can't walk. The family are carrying her 2-3 kilometers to get to the hospital with no car, no wheelchair. And this is a malnutritioned family who are already exhausted, and now they're trying to bring in their grandmother. Then you've got women who have just given birth to a newborn, and they've given birth at home and not been able to come in. And then this child is sick, hasn't been able to eat anything the first 2 days of life. Then you've got people who have been released from imprisonment camps that they've been taken away by the Israeli soldiers, and you have to deal with their injuries and their beatings and broken ribs and that. Then you've got the people that come in with things like hepatitis A and they're jaundiced. And I saw, one of the most difficult things I think I saw was a 14-year-old girl who had hepatitis A, and her family had brought her to hospital 5 times. And this time when they brought her in, she'd actually went into full liver failure from the hepatitis A. And when she went into full liver failure, the liver no longer works, so it can't purify the blood from the toxins. So these toxins cross the blood-brain barrier, and essentially when she arrived at hospital, she was brain dead. So it was a 14-year-old girl who was brain dead from liver failure, and we spent about an hour trying to resuscitate her, and she died. And she wasn't the first one, and she wasn't the last one that I saw of children coming in with liver failure from hepatitis A and dying from it. Another thing was when the aid trucks would come in, the aid trucks are not allowed to stop. So they would drive, and obviously the roads are destroyed and bombed, so there's no markings or anything like that. So these aid trucks, as they would drive, people sometimes would surround the aid truck. Sometimes people are just living in those areas because there's no road, so they're camping out in those areas. And those aid trucks would run over people, and they would run over children and things like that. So, you know, we were seeing...
Accidentally.
Accidentally, accidentally, you just don't know, because obviously they have instructions about where they have to go, when they're allowed to get there and things like that. And there's obviously people who are desperate as well, who are trying to take some of the aid as well. So all of this creates chaos, and, you know, people get ran over. So, you know, you were then seeing children coming in who have been hit by, you know, 15-ton trailers hitting a child, you know, a malnourished child. I mean, you can imagine what the outcome of something like that is. So, you know, it was chaotic, and there's no air conditioning. It was in the middle of summer, and it's 50 degrees. There's hundreds of people. People are pulling you left, right, and center. You've got someone who's got liver failure. You've got someone who's having a miscarriage. You've got someone whose child is malnutritioned and is taking their last breaths. And then on top of all of that, then you get a mass casualty event, and you get people who have just had an entire building blown up with them inside and them being pulled out. So, you know, it was a very, very intense environment when working in the emergency department. There was no respite.
Could imagine.
Dr. Jeremy, how fully equipped, or how well equipped, were the hospitals in terms of resources, equipment, medicine?
Yeah, it's on all levels, they were severely under-equipped. So obviously the direct medical equipment that we use, so for myself in the operating theatres, things like breathing tubes, there were periods of time where breathing tubes were being recycled between patients, where we'd normally use one per patient. The number of, you know, syringes, needles, those sorts of things was very carefully managed, because while there may have been a reasonable supply at that time, we wouldn't know when the next lot would become available. So we had to very carefully ration all those basic pieces of equipment, which we take for granted here. Then there's with the traumas that would come through. A lot of these patients would need drains in their chest, they'd need breathing tubes, they'd need catheters put in their bladder, these sorts of things. And all these bits of equipment, as they're getting used up, they're not being replaced. So there would often be a shortfall in a lot of these things. Even basic things like cannulas, which we use to give IV fluids, would come in short supply at various stages. The drugs was another issue altogether. A lot of the basic anaesthesia medications were available in some small supply, but the big one that we like to use is opioid medications, or morphine-like medications, which are very strong painkillers. The availability of these was next to nothing. Yeah, so where we'd normally utilise, you know, multiple vials of these medications, even in one case potentially, we might have one vial available to us for a whole day's worth of operating, which is just completely insufficient. So we were relying on some very basic pain relief medications to get us by, and people suffered because of that.
So you would conduct major operations with little or no anaesthetics?
So the anaesthetic itself, to keep them asleep for the operation, we would have adequate amounts of that to be able to conduct the operations, but then to manage their pain relief in the aftermath, or even beforehand if required, it was extraordinarily difficult, because we just didn't have the resources, we didn't have the drugs available. And there was no opportunity to bring them in with us, because those sorts of medications all medications were barred from being brought in across the border. I think the other one to mention, though, is that an important resource in hospitals is cleaning products. And these are in massive shortfall if they were even available. So you might see people going around with a mop cleaning floors. It was often just with water, and that water's often tainted and not clean itself. And then, like Dr. Mo mentioned before, the sewage management was abysmal, and not through anyone's fault, except for the fact that because hospitals are one of the safest places to be, you had a huge community of civilians living in and around the hospital, where the services weren't geared up to manage those numbers. And so the sewage and waste management would become overwhelmed very quickly. So you'd end up with pools of refuse at various places around the hospital. We'd have massive piles of rubbish just, in various places as well. And not only is that very unpleasant to live around, it's also a nidus for new infections to grow, as we've seen, like the re-emergence of the poliovirus.
Dr. Mohamed, from your patients, how many would have been women and children, the percentage?
I mean, it was the vast majority of patients were women and children. Obviously there was men sometimes, but every time there was a mass casualty event, I don't think there was many times where there was actually a lot of men in those mass casualty events. A lot of the time it was dozens of women and children, because when you'd have a mass casualty event, it would be a tent site that would be bombed, it would be a school housing women and children, and yeah, there would just be dozens of children that would come in.
So these patients were a result of targeted bombings, or were they just collateral damage?
It's hard to say that the tens of thousands of children that have been killed are not intentional, but we went over there in a capacity of, we were just working in the hospital and just dealing with what was coming. I was there when they managed to free those 4 Israeli hostages, but in the process they killed 400 people and injured 700. And it's hard when you've got that many women and children brought in lifeless, with heads blown off, limbs blown off, sniper shot wounds to the head. It's hard to say that was not, that wasn't intentional.
Terrible. Dr. Jeremy, can you describe how your particular living quarters were, the meals that you received, who arranged that?
So fortunately, the group that I went with had a small group of sort of local volunteers that would help us out with that. Obviously, any food source is extremely expensive on the ground because of availability. So demand is high, supply is low, so that means the cost is high as well. So we were able to take an amount of money in with us, and we basically gave that to the volunteers working with us and said, can you just make sure we have a supply of food? So it was a lot of basic food, but we were always had one good meal a day, and then we'd have a bit of snacking stuff on either side of that as well. So more adequate to sustain us, and at times that we often felt guilty that we were actually able to eat a good solid meal. It's at one stage when we were there, they started bringing frozen chickens back into Gaza, and this was a huge deal. They hadn't had any frozen chickens or any chicken or poultry for more than 2 months. And so when they started arriving, we were fortunate to be able to afford to pay for those things.
Which is my next question. For those who didn't have money and the locals living there, how did they sustain themselves?
Yeah, so there were sort of aid food boxes available as well, but this is all non-perishable things. So it was maybe a small quantity of rice, some oil, some sort of canned vegetable, canned lentils, or some sort of legume, but very, very basic and just enough to sustain themselves. And it wasn't sort of doled out, this family has, 10 people, so they get 2 boxes or something like this. It was, someone arrived, you get a box, you take what you can get. So there certainly wasn't enough to sustain those people. And so a lot of people were going very hungry. In the areas where I was, because of the way the trucks came in, it seemed to be that the aid drops were, the further north they travelled, the less availability there was, as things got stripped off as the trucks moved up north. So the north was really suffering, and is still suffering very badly from lack of nutrition, and also the cost of nutritious food as well. But yeah, it's across the board. To put a bit of perspective on it, a kilo of tomatoes up in the north is somewhere around $50 US. And this is going back about a month as well, so that could have changed significantly. To buy an onion was about $9 or $10 an onion. Yeah. Cucumbers were were a delicacy as well. So looking at paying us $8, $9 each. And a colleague of mine actually travelled to the north to operate just after I'd left in mid-July. And at that stage, they took with them a bag of apples. And they hadn't had any apples up in the north of Gaza since around the time that the war began. So these people were celebrating and laughing and just in a state of disbelief that they were given apples.
What about water supply? Do they have clean water?
You know, there's nothing clean, and there's nothing like a sure supply of anything. So there are wells and things like that, and there are people that work that get the water, and you know they distribute out the water, and people have to pay for the water as well. So what you'll find is at the end of a street there'll be a truck that will come and it will have water, and people will come with their bottles, and they'll have plastic bottles that they would have had with them for months, and they'll fill up that plastic bottle and take it with them to their tent, and that would be their water. So there was no running water per se, but what a lot of people would use is they would camp by the sea, and they would use the seawater to wash themselves with, and then they would have this water that they'd fill up their bottles with, and that they would keep that in their tent, and that would be their drinking water.
With regards to the spirit of the Palestinian people, you mentioned resilience. Can you shed some light on that?
Well, I think the fact that they've been living under war conditions like not many people in modern day could grapple or understand, that they're severely deprived of everything, and yet they keep going. They keep going. They find a way to put a smile on their face, and they obviously have a very strong relationship and a very profound relationship with God, with Allah, and that faith is something that really shines through with the people in Palestine. At least that's what I saw going in as a white boy that was brought up as a Catholic. It was quite it was an amazing experience to see people with such profound faith and belief in their God, and in some ways it's provided me with a lot of comfort, because these people know that despite their suffering there is something good for them at the end of this, and the more they suffer the greater their reward. And for those who have perished at the hands of the armed forces, they're not called the dead, they're called the martyrs, and so a lot of families will celebrate the fact that if their family member was taken from them, it was done in a fashion that was in full submission to God, and with the belief that as a martyr that puts them at the highest station.
Astounding.
Yeah.
That's unheard of.
Absolutely. And actually, Dr. Mo and I have had discussions about this as well. Yeah. And, I remember Dr. Mo saying to me one day that these families will say, over the body of their deceased family member, they'll say, Alhamdulillah, because they had this time, they were given this time with their family member. And there's the saying that, God gives and then we'll return to God as well.
So long until Allah will return.
Yeah, that's right. And so that came out in everything. Yeah. And so, like Mo mentioned as well, you walk down the corridors in the hospital, and there'd be people camped out here, there, and everywhere. But also at prayer time, you would also find all these people praying together in certain different areas as well. A lot of mosques were damaged. People who were living on the hospital campus would be afraid to go out to find a mosque that was still standing. So they would pray together in the hospital, and it was like one big community. It was amazing.
I think a lot of people, when they talk about this, they talk about obviously the resilience and the courage of the people of Gaza, and that's been evidently shining through. However, I think what a lot of people don't understand, and what a lot of people I think need to understand, is that there is a lot of suffering, and it's not easy. These are human beings, and it's real human emotions. And someone will say Alhamdulillah over their over the dead, children, their wife, their husband, but you can feel the pain. You can feel the pain and the sorrow and how much it cuts deep. I mean, some of the things with the screams, the screams are the things that still haunt me, like when you hear a mother crying over her child and, it breaks you a little bit. And I remember there was a grown woman, she's old enough to be my grandma. She came up to me and she went, in Arabic, she said, "Ya doctor, idek baraka," which means your hands are a blessing. And she started kissing my hands and she goes, "Please, don't let it die." And, I'm looking at her daughter's burnt, 80% burns to the body. Her limbs are blown off. She's dead, but she's kissing my hands and saying, "Please save my daughter." So, these people, they're not, everyone wants to portray the people of Gaza as these like superhumans, and they're all, so religiously devout and they're okay with whatever happens to them, that they're not okay with what happens to them. And that is a duty on all of us to help relieve that suffering. It's not just to sit back and say, "Oh, you know what, these people, they can handle it." You know what I mean? It's all a test for them. They're not the ones being tested right now. It's us that's being tested because we're allowing this to happen. We're not doing enough to help support these people. They're starving to death. They're watching their children die. And the niceties of, they say alhamdulillah when bad things happen to them, and we should all be like that. But
Faith teaches us that.
it's part of our faith.
It's our reaction.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is sometimes we also need to take a step back and it's when you see the aftermath of it, because you see someone say alhamdulillah over body and say to Allah belong, to Allah will return. But you see the mother just sat there holding the child for 2 or 3 hours, just holding her dead child in the emergency room, and I know that woman is broken inside. She's gonna get up and she's gonna go pray and she's gonna continue her life and continue her day, and they're going to keep persevering. But I think, like, for me, what really hit was just like the price that they're paying these people. I mean, a father would come in and he would bring five body bags with him, and it would be all his children just burnt alive, limbs blown off, head blown off. And what do I say to comfort a man like that? There's nothing that you can say. And their patience inspires you and their bravery inspires you. There were times where I would come in and obviously, there's no painkillers, there's no, there's overcrowding of the hospital. And I remember there was one man that I saw and he had his leg blown off and I, tied a tourniquet around his leg to stop the bleeding. And there's other people that have got burns and everyone's screaming in pain. And this guy just sat on the bed and he had a Quran open and he was just reading the Quran silently while his leg had been blown off. And I just, I remember just being so profoundly struck. I was like, for him, this is where he's at now. He's already accepted his fate. There were things like that would just make you, there was a child, I don't know if you met this child, but there was a child that used to go out with the paramedics. He used to go out to get patients and bring them back to the hospital. This is a 9-year-old child, putting lines in patients and things like that. And, I remember he would come in and he would tell me about the patient that he's about to bring in. And, I see him, this child, and I go to myself, wow, this guy, he's going to the fire. He's, the bombs are raining down and he's running to it to help people. And then I have another child here who's having panic attacks and a child who's just had a heart attack from the anxiety from these bombs, because we were seeing children having heart attacks. And, you have to look at it as a spectrum. There are these brave people that can withstand and endure, but there are others that can't. And we need to help them. And that was, that was the thing that was profound for me was like, there's a spectrum of suffering and there's a spectrum of resilience. And not everybody there is 100% resilience. There are people that are really struggling and it would break you, because you could see yourself in the person that was struggling and you would then take hope and inspiration from the person who's resilient. But that person isn't always resilient and that person isn't always suffering. It goes in waves, and you saw that the whole time that you were there.
And both of those responses are completely adequate responses. Well, for the person who just goes internal and just, blocks out the world, that's a complete, like coming from someone who's never experienced that directly, that would be a completely acceptable response. And yeah, I guess the point is that these people continue because they have the choice of they keep going or they don't. There's not really much option.
Yeah.
So part of this resilience is a quality of, an intrinsic quality of these people because they've been living like this for decades.
Yeah.
And part of it is that, well, they don't really have a choice either.
And a lot of them just embrace the death. They say if death comes, it comes. And I think that was always, something that was so profound because over here we love to live our life. We look forward to the weekend, we look forward to our holiday and this, that and the other, and they're so indifferent about life or death. They see it as just another chapter, another phase. They've got this many family members that have been killed. For them, it's like, if I die, I'm just going with them.
Yeah.
Like you said, when you were doing the anesthetic and like people would be waking up from the anesthetic, like.
Yeah. So one of the drugs we had access to is something called ketamine. It is a drug of abuse in some countries, like Western countries where the availability is higher. But it's an older drug, but it's very good for anaesthetising patients. But it's a very good pain relieving medication too. One of the sort of side effects though is that some people have these sort of hallucinations and this sort of thing. So what we often see here in the Western developed countries is people coming down off ketamine, if you like, will sort of have these weird responses. They'll be saying funny things and or saying inappropriate things and this sort of thing. What we saw consistently in Gaza, though, was that when we give some ketamine to do a procedure or change the dressing or something like this, people would often come out of it singing full belt surahs from the Quran. And it was just amazing. You could hear them, from tens of meters away, he just bellowing out these like in song. It was just, it was quite an experience. Yeah.
Considering the circumstances that they have experienced, you would expect them to have a lot of hatred and anger inside. Did you perceive that?
It was what people wanted was they were distressed at the suffering and the neglect. They didn't have access to basic things for sustenance, but I never found them to be overtly disrespectful or saying, I hate this person or I hate that person.
Mm-hmm.
They would just ask, why is this happening to us? Why are you doing this to us?
Yeah.
But never in such a way that they would blurt overt
there was
disrespect.
And that was the thing. Like there wasn't hatred in these people's hearts. Like a man would come and his whole children would be killed, and you would think to yourself, if he was swearing at the people who did this and cursing them, maybe you'd understand. But there was none of that. I never once heard anyone curse the other side. All I heard them say was Alhamdulillah, and to Allah we belong and to Allah we return. And that was the thing that was so profound. Like, their focus wasn't so much on this life. They weren't focused on, we need to get them back, or we hate this person for doing this. They were just focused on, this is where we're going now. These are our martyrs, these are our shuhada, this is, let's bury them, let's respect our dead, and let's just move on with life. Because, for them, it was just part and parcel of life. They weren't looking to the other side. And, that was something that always I was really profound by, was just seeing how steadfast they were, how focused they were on their faith.
SubhanAllah. Personal impact. How would you say your time in Gaza impacted you as a person?
It's opened my eyes up to what real suffering is. It provides a lot of perspective in terms of what I perceive as issues or problems in my life. It just allows us to sort of reevaluate and decide what things matter most. And so one thing I've found that matters a lot is how much time we have in this life, and so making the most of that. So spending the time with my children, spending the time with my family, and showing my appreciation of them. It's also opened my eyes to as growing up in Australia, as a brought up as a Catholic. I didn't have a huge understanding of Islam as a religion, but it's opening my eyes to the the faith and the practices of the Muslim population, and how beautiful religion it really is, and it doesn't get the credit it deserves in terms of being a peaceful, inclusive. It gets a bad rap in the Western world, when really there's a lot of things that I think everyone can take away in terms of daily practices and outlook and inclusivity and all those sorts of things. I think if more people thought like this, the world could be a much more peaceful place.
Thank you. Dr. Mohamed, what would you like to say to our audience regarding what we can do? I mean, we are very fortunate to have people like yourselves who've actually took the time and gone over to Gaza and experienced those conditions and did what you could to help them. What can we do as a nation, as a community, to help the people of Gaza?
I mean, there's, you can look at it in multiple different ways. You can say, what can you do politically? What can you do socially? I think the answer always comes back to internally. You can't control the politics. You can't control, say, if you donate money, you can't control if that's going to get to the person that it's going to get to. It might be blocked. The charity might take a lot of cut for it. The only thing that you can control is yourself and your actions. And, for me, when I went over there, I always prayed my 5 prayers, and I always fasted, and I always did my charity. I always did all of those things. But when I went there, it changed the way that I viewed those things. Sometimes as a Muslim, you can get stuck in the monotony of just waking up for Fajr and praying this prayer and going to Jummah, and it becomes like a routine. But when I was there, it was different. When we'd pray, me and the doctors that were there, we'd get up for Fajr prayer, and the bombs were going off, and the room was shaking while we were praying Fajr. And that was really profound for me. I was like, wow, this is what it must have been like for the Sahaba back in the day, and people like that, where we're right in the middle of this, and we're all waking up for Fajr together and praying together. And I've never met these guys before, but we're all in this together as one ummah. And every time when I start praying and my thoughts begin to wander, I always just focus back on Gaza, and it helps me focus a lot more. And I think for people, what can you do in a situation like this? It's so easy to feel helpless. I went over there and I helped, and I still felt helpless. So there's nothing that I'm going to say to you that's going to make it, be easy or make you feel better about the situation. But one thing that you can do is just be a better version of yourself. You know what I mean? Don't let their death be in vain. Let it bring you closer to our faith. Let it bring you closer to Allah. Let it make you into a better person. And, all the other things, I don't need to tell you, go give charity, support, make your voices heard, and peaceful protests and things like that. But the only thing that you can control is yourself. So just try and find a better relationship with Allah, a better relationship with yourself, a better relationship with your family. Because when you see what they've gone through, it makes you understand what really the value of life is.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Mohamed. And thank you very much also, Dr. Jeremy. You're going to leave for Gaza again tonight. May Allah make your journey safe and bring you back safely. Thank you for joining us on TBN for our very first podcast episode. We hope you found it valuable and insightful. If you enjoyed what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. We look forward to having you with us again. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.